Welcome to the Truth and Liberty Show, where trusted leaders bring biblical insights to important issues to help you stand for truth and effect godly change in our nation and in our world.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to Truth and Liberty. So glad you could be joining us today. We're going to have a great program today. Our special guest is going to be Matt Staver, one of the best lawyers I know, the founder and president of Liberty Counsel. You know, I have hope for America. And one of the reasons I have hope for America is because of what I see happening in the courts of this nation. This year, this Supreme Court term began this year on October the 6th. And the Supreme Court is facing several important cases. And, you know, we are seeing leftist ideology retreating on the national stage in many different places. And yet progressives are still pushing hard at the state level and also in the courts. But we have reason to be optimistic today. You know, by executive order, President Trump has banned DEI from the federal government, essentially. The Department of Defense is getting set right side up with Secretary Hegseth as they're purging this woke progressivism from the ranks of the military, returning to their purpose as a fighting force designed to defend the interests of the United States. The Department of Education is being reduced drastically in size, and also the funding through the DOE of these woke DEI programs in schools is being shut down. As a result of DEI programs, however, across the nation, education establishments are reeling, you know, from these cutbacks. This is spawning lots of litigation, which is still working its way through the courts. Some red states now are passing laws banning girls in boys' sports, banning transgender surgeries on minors, and other woke priorities. But blue states have forged ahead with radical ideology. Like in Colorado, for example, right here, last year in the last legislative session, the liberal Democrat-controlled government of Colorado passed a law requiring all businesses across the state to use transgender people's preferred names and pronouns at all times in their advertising, in their public statements, when they're interacting with the people, and all sorts of other circumstances. This is obviously an unconstitutional restriction on the freedom of speech and on the freedom of conscience of those who believe that transgenderism is a lie, rooted in a lie, and it violates their own conscience to participate in it. So Truth and Liberty, for example, we filed an amicus brief in a case challenging that new law. But you know, Colorado is already one of the most radical abortion and pro-homosexual and trans states in America. Jack Phillips, the owner and creator of Masterpiece Cake Shop, has been brought before the Colorado Civil Rights Commission 3 times, and 3 times he's gone up to the Supreme Court. Why? Because he refuses to bake a wedding cake expressly celebrating a gay wedding, right? Because he knows that in good conscience, he cannot use the gifts and talents and abilities that God has given him to celebrate something which God says is an abomination. Well, the Civil Rights Commission was slapped down by the Supreme Court once, saying your hostility towards religious belief is impermissible. You have to redo the case. There's another case called 303 Creative that came up out of the Colorado Civil Rights Commission. In this case, a wedding photographer, she has a website where she would take videos and photographs of weddings. Well, a gay couple came to her, and for the same reason as Jack Phillips, she said, "I'm sorry, but I can't service a gay wedding." And they sued her in the Civil Rights Commission, and it went all the way to the United States Supreme Court. And the court there said that is unconstitutional for you to fine her or punish her because she has a constitutional right to exercise her religious beliefs and to express them. You can't force her to express a view that is repugnant to her religious beliefs, to her conscience, if you will. Well, once again, here in Colorado, another case is headed up to the Supreme Court. This one is called Childs v. Salazar. You see, back in 2019, the radical Colorado legislature passed a law saying it's illegal for mental health care providers, in other words, counselors, psychotherapists, and so forth, to help a minor who is trying to get out of same-sex attraction. So you're under the age of 18, puberty, you're feeling attraction to the same sex, you know it's that homosexuality is wrong, you're confused, you want out of it, your parent wants you, is working with you or whatever, and you go to a counselor and say, I'm struggling with this issue and I need help. The Colorado government said, thou shalt not help that child. Well, that's obviously unconstitutional. It's obviously immoral and wrong, but it is the law of this state. Well, Childs v. Salazar is challenging that. Childs, the plaintiff, is a mental health professional who says, you know what, first off, I have the freedom to say what I want to say according to the truth, and I also have the freedom under the Constitution to speak according to my sincerely held religious beliefs, and I have a right, therefore, to counsel people and help them escape same-sex attraction. That case was just accepted by the Supreme Court. I believe it's going to have a positive result. By the way, what the liberals and the LGBT community call that kind of counseling is they call it conversion therapy. And they try to make it sound like some sort of dark ages treatment where people are, having lobotomies and shock therapy and drowning and all kinds of stuff to shock them out of being gay. That's not what we're talking about today, folks. We're talking about helping people who want to escape it, who want to find deliverance. And we're going to talk about that more. But, another radical state where this leftist woke ideology is still being pursued with vim and vigor is California. California is an abortion and a trans destination state. Colorado is an abortion destination state. You can get an abortion in Colorado and California and Oregon and Washington and many other places all the way up through birth. No questions asked, no restrictions. Furthermore, in California, a minor can go there and get transgender surgery. In other words, have breasts removed, other body parts removed, new body parts sewn on, or whatever you want to call it. This mutilating process with hormone therapy and everything else that totally alters and even destroys the human body. And you can do that even if you live in another state. Even if in your home state, it would be illegal to do so. California says, nope, the doors are wide open here. Bring your minor children to have them mutilated. Well, these issues are still, I don't want to say they're alive and well. The Lord has prophesied through Andrew Womack that the woke ideology is coming down, and we can see it happening with our very own eyes, and we rejoice in that. What I'm trying to say is this fight is not over. We still have a lot of ground that we have to take, and it's going to take dedicated work, hard work by Christians and believers in all segments of society, but especially in the courts. We need Christian lawyers. We need Christian legislators. We need Christian attorneys to get into the fight and begin to challenge these things and to fight for a restoration of the biblical foundations of this nation and a restoration of the principles upon which the nation was based, the idea of natural law and so on. Some of the cases that are pending right now that are out there. A teacher, for example, is facing termination for having a crucifix sitting on her desk at school. 2 airline employees were fired because they spoke up when their airline announced that the company was backing the Equality Act in Congress, which would have eliminated their protections for religious speech. That's right. If they had spoken up inside the workplace and said, well, we believe, according to the Bible, that homosexuality is wrong and transgenderism is wrong, that God created a male and female and sex should be confined to marriage, they would be violating the law under the Equality Act. Well, this airline says, we support the Equality Act. Provide your comments. So these 2 employees provided their comments and they were fired. There's another case out there. An evangelist in Missouri was banned by a local town from preaching the gospel in a city park. We have this other problem throughout the entire country today, even in red states. Pornographic, obscene material is in our children's libraries, in our public schools, and even as curriculum. I was just at a seminar last week where this problem was being discussed as it exists here in Colorado. And there were excerpts read from some of these books. I mean, these things will embarrass you. They would turn a biker red, right, with embarrassment. I mean, whatever. This stuff is graphic. It has no place in our schools. And yet we're running up against claims that we are trying to censor, claims that we're Nazi book burners, and all this kind of stuff. I guess according to the progressive left, anything and everything is okay for a child to read and consume, even if it doesn't have any literary or educational value, because we have to keep an open mind after all. I want to say, what about protecting our kids? Don't we have an obligation to protect our kids from harmful ideas, harmful material? And I know there's a balance here, obviously. But would you take your young child to an X-rated movie? Then why would you have them read these books? Would you take them into a brothel and have them witness sex acts? Of course not. So why would you expose them to pornography? And many of these books contain sexual abuse accounts, graphic accounts of sexual abuse, of drug abuse, of rebellion against legal authority, of rebellion against parents, of horrible profanity, and all kinds of other things. And and so you think it's okay to give these to our students, all in the name of having an open mind. Well, I think that's insane. And I think it's an abrogation of our responsibility as adults. These fights that we're in, they're essential. They really go to the heart of our founding principles as a nation. The First Amendment says that Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. It also says Congress shall make no law prohibiting or restricting the freedom of speech. But the First Amendment was never intended to silence religious expression, religious speech, or Christian or religious participation in government. It was never intended to prevent our laws from being based on biblical values. But Joe Biden and Barack Obama before him, they did a great deal of harm. One of the things they did was something called the abortion pill, for example. So the abortion pill, relatively new medication, but with this, it's actually a two-part medication, but with it, a woman can take it and abort her pregnancy, right? She doesn't, it's not necessary for her to have a doctor actually remove the baby from her womb. Her body will do it if she takes these drugs. It used to be that this drug was regulated by the FDA. It could not be shipped by mail. It had to be prescribed by a doctor, and it had to be administered in a clinical setting. Now, I think the pill ought to be completely and totally illegal, right? It's murdering an innocent human being. But these common sense safety procedures or restrictions were in place for a reason, and Joe Biden did away with them, right? During COVID, and the FDA never went back. Today, more than half of the abortions in America are a result of this abortion pill. And there's lots of bad stuff that's happening as a result of it. Our guest today has a lot of good, helpful information on this. But another one is gay marriage. In the year 2015, during Barack Obama's second administration, the United States Supreme Court decided a case called Obergefell versus Hodges. Now, it's been so long ago now, 10 years, that people are beginning to forget what a cultural earthquake Obergefell was, and legal earthquake, if you will. Because there was no such thing as gay marriage prior to Obergefell, except I think maybe Vermont had gone there, maybe Oregon. But the Supreme Court of the United States in Obergefell said, not only can a state allow two homosexuals to marry, no, every state in the Union must, under the United States Constitution, must allow and enforce and give equal status to homosexual marriage. In deciding that case, the court basically turned a blind eye to 6,000 years of human history, 240 years of American history, the entire history of Christian civilization in the West, the entire common law. Because gay marriage has never been recognized in the entire history of Western civilization. And it's completely contrary to the Bible and the principles upon which our nation was based. But somehow, this court, somehow these justices in Washington, D.C. decided that they had the power to undo all this and find a right to gay marriage in a document that never once mentions marriage, never once mentions homosexuality or sex at all. right? But they found it there. Well, folks, we're not done with the gay marriage debate. We're not done with the gay marriage case. Let me say this, the impact of the gay marriage case, that Obergefell decision, cannot be understated. The damaging effect on America and on our culture. I don't mean to moralize here, and I don't mean to preach, but we have to remember, homosexuality, the act, is contrary, and especially homosexual marriage, it's contrary to all standards of morality throughout history. There has never been a culture or a civilization that embraced that conduct and thrived and even survived. Usually it manifests, becomes acceptable in the final stages of the decay of a civilization. We can look back at ancient Greece. We can look back at ancient Rome. We can look back at Sodom and Gomorrah and throughout history. And it's always at the latter end of the deterioration of a culture and a society. Homosexuality is contrary to natural law. What do I mean by that? I mean the moral law of God that's built into creation and in the Scripture. Let's look at creation. There are basically no animals that practice homosexuality, right? It can happen in occasional instances, but it is not a common thing, and it does not produce life. It does not reproduce the species, and it's an aberration at best. It is unnatural if you look at human biology, and I don't need to get graphic here, but it is using body parts for purposes that they are obviously not designed for. And God made us male and female from the beginning. The Scripture is very clear. A man shall leave his father and mother and cleave unto his wife. A man does not cleave unto his husband, and a wife does not cleave unto her wife. Okay? And in many scriptures, for example, like Leviticus chapter 18, verse 22, you shall not lie with a male as with a woman. It is an abomination. This is the New King James Version. Even if you look at the somewhat liberal paraphrased version, the New Living Translation, it says this: do not practice homosexuality. Having sex with another man as with a woman, it is a detestable sin. Am I saying this to condemn people today? I'm not saying it to condemn anyone. I'm saying this to say, as America, we must not, as the church in America, listen, brothers and sisters, we cannot allow this to stand. This has to be undone. We cannot rest until Obergefell is overturned and godly biblical marriage is reestablished as the norm, as the only standard that is acceptable in our culture for marriage. Leviticus 20, verse 13, if a man lies with a male as with a woman, both of them have committed an abomination. They shall surely be put to death. Oh, Richard, you're calling for homosexuals to be put to death. No, I'm not saying that today. This is in the law of Moses, but I'm illustrating the principle, the spiritual principle, that it is not acceptable to God, that it is an abomination, that it's contrary to the law of nature. Western civilization has never embraced it. Look at Sodom and Gomorrah. Look at Romans chapter 1. Romans chapter 1 says that as men become unthankful, they reject the knowledge of God. Men give themselves over, their bodies over, to be used with other men, and women with women to do those things which are unseemly. And then they become reprobate in their imaginations and so on. And so this is a very serious matter. Why am I going into all of this in today's monologue when I'm talking about the courts? I'm talking about this because our next guest has a case that is uniquely positioned with the potential to achieve the overturn of Obergefell versus Hodges. So the case involves a woman by the name of Kim Davis. Kim was the county clerk or registrar in some official capacity in a small town in Kentucky. Before Obergefell, it was after Obergefell, two gay men came and requested a marriage license. Ms. Davis, being a Christian of strong, biblical foundations, recognized that she could not biblically participate in that and refused to give them a license. Well, they caused a stink and protested, and she was actually terminated from her position. These two gay men then sued her, even though they finally got their license and they got I suppose they got married. We'll have to ask our guest about this. But they sued her for civil damages. And basically, they have recovered now a judgment against her of over $300,000. And she is facing bankruptcy today because of it. Well, her case is now in front of the United States Supreme Court. The court has to decide whether it will hear the Davis case. And we pray to God that they would take the case, because it has the potential to not only to affirm the freedom of religion, the rights of Christians in government to act according to their conscience, but it also has the potential to overturn Obergefell, right? For the court to say, you know, that case upon which this marriage license was supposedly authorized was not rightly decided. Because just like Roe versus Wade, Obergefell has no basis in history, no basis in natural law, and no basis in the United States Constitution, right? As I said, the Constitution says nothing about sex or marriage. The regulation of marriage has always been left to the states. For the United States Supreme Court to step in and say that this document somehow requires all states to acknowledge gay marriage on an equal footing with traditional opposite-sex marriage is just a completely invented out of whole cloth. And we do believe that there are justices on the Supreme Court today that were not there during Obergefell that recognize this common sense and obvious fact. So, you know, let me just go on with this topic for just a minute before we transition to our interview. Originally, the gay movement, the homosexual movement in America and in the West, they said they wanted tolerance. We just want you to tolerate us, to let us, you know, do what we want in the privacy of our own lives, right? Sex is a private matter, and we just, you know, this is who we are and what we are, and it's none of your business. Just don't discriminate against us or hate us. They called it homophobia. Do you remember that? And then they said, you know, it's not really fair that married couples have advantages legally that we don't have. So we ought to have, we don't want marriage. No. We want civil unions. Just give us this piece of paper that says, you know, we can have different rights like health insurance benefits and other stuff like this that married couples get. Okay, so all over the place, states and cities say, okay, civil unions, but it's not marriage. And then they start saying, wait a second, love is love. Equality is equality. We have a right to be married to the person we love. And so this movement for gay marriage begins. But you know, even after Obergefell, it didn't stop. Now they want the right to marry multiple spouses simultaneously. They want the right to marry or have sex legally with children. They want the right to transition the bodies of children from male to the appearance of female and from female to the appearance of male by mutilating them and administering these mind and body altering medications. They want to obliterate parental rights in school, saying we can groom and teach and indoctrinate and eventually transition physically your child without your permission or knowledge. They want to bind up our freedom of speech and religion by saying, you have to call me a male even if I know you're a female. You have to marry me even if it's against your sincerely held religious beliefs and participate in my religion. You know, we have a right to give the children and the power to give the children of this nation access to horribly damaging pornography in our schools and libraries, and you can't call it bad. That's not allowed, you prude, you closed-minded, right-wing Christian nationalist. You know, they have unbelievable displays in public. There was a parade last year, I think it was, or maybe earlier this year, where a gay pride parade where people were literally walking and riding bicycles through the street of our country naked in front of children. You know, these obscene halftime shows and Hollywood award ceremonies where they worship the devil and do all sorts of other stuff in provocative, obscene manner. And you know, guys, this is not going to stop. It's not going to stop the degradation of our culture and society, the erosion of family, the erosion of our civil liberties. This LGBT movement is satanic. It is from hell. And it will not end until the gospel itself is eliminated from our society. The church must fight. We must fight now. There is no one that I know who fights better and fights harder and even more effectively than Matt Staver. He's the founder and president of Liberty Counsel. Liberty Counsel is more than a law firm. It's a ministry. It's a ministry that fights in our culture, but it also fights in our courts, representing people of faith as they stand up for Christian values of the rights of conscience and the rights of free speech. The list of cases that Matt and his amazing team of attorneys have won in courts all the way and governmental bodies all the way from city councils to the United States Supreme Court there's pages and pages of victories. He's played a hand in some of the most important decisions of the United States Supreme Court in the last 50 years. And I have utmost respect for him. He and his team represented this ministry in a battle against the state of Colorado during the COVID pandemic, and they just provided exceptional legal services. And so I'm very honored today to bring Matt back on Truth and Liberty to talk about what he's doing today about the Kim Davis case and more. So stay tuned. We're going to take a short break, and we'll be right back after that break with one of the best lawyers in America, Matt Staver. Are you passionate about standing for truth in the culture, but don't know how to get started? Well, Truth and Liberty, our mission is to educate, unify, and mobilize the body of Christ to stand for truth in the public square. And as part of our mission, we provide you with an amazing array of resources on our website. And our website has just been revamped, remodeled, and retooled to be user-friendly. And I'm so excited about it because I believe that there's nothing like it out there anywhere. I want to encourage you today to go to truthandliberty.net and check out the Resources Center and the Get Equipped Center. On our Resources Center, you will find hundreds of links, hundreds of videos, articles, blogs, even America's original founding documents can be found on Truth and Liberty's Resources Center. It's searchable by topic, preset topic, or you can put in a custom search to find exactly what you need and what you're interested in. In the Get Equipped section, we link you to tools created by our strategic partners, including Pray, Vote, and Engage tools. We culture impact teams, civic action teams, biblical citizenship in modern America, biblical worldview training, and more. So go today to truthandliberty.net and find what you need to get equipped to stand for truth in the public square. Okay, everybody, welcome back to Truth and Liberty. I hope you enjoyed that break. Our special guest today is my good friend, Matt Staver, who's the founder and president of Liberty Counsel, one of the most important, I would venture to say, one of the most important legal organizations in America, certainly when you're talking about a biblical worldview and the restoration of our founding principles as a nation. Matt, it's so good to have you on Truth and Liberty again.
Richard, it's always good to be with you and with the whole team there.
You know, Matt, I'm a lawyer, so I love getting into this stuff, but I think one of the areas that the average everyday American quite doesn't fully appreciate, not any fault of their own, but is the importance of the rulings that come out of our court system and the Supreme Court especially. And that's where your bread and butter is, your list of victories in the Supreme Court and really at courts all over the country for biblical values and America's founding principles is just amazing. What is happening now at the Supreme Court? Can you kind of give us an overview of where we are? I know that their term just began in October, but things are already hot and heavy, if you will. Lots of
Well, they are. In fact, one of the cases that was just argued was involving counseling by Christian counselors to clients that want to overcome unwanted same-sex attractions, behaviors, and gender confusion. That's out of your state in Colorado.
Mm-hmm.
And the court there went the wrong way and upheld that law.
Yeah,
We began the litigation at Liberty Counsel in 2012. The first law that was actually passed was out of California, and it was by then Senator Lieu, who was in the state legislature. And it was a radical attempt to politicize the LGBTQ agenda and silence counselors from helping clients who wanted to overcome unwanted, and I want to emphasize that unwanted, people that came to a counselor voluntarily, they have these unwanted desires, same-sex attractions perhaps. They're engaging in unwanted same-sex behaviors. They want to change their behavior, or they're having gender confusion. They want to get help. They want to align their values with their situation, and they want to overcome these urges, these confused states. And in California, the law said you can't help them, that you have to actually override their views or override their objectives and force a pro LGBTQ agenda on them. In other words, counselors are permitted to tell someone, oh, you're born in the wrong body. We'll give you puberty blockers, opposite sex hormones, and then we'll go through mutilating surgeries and all will be well. But a counselor would not be able to help that client walk through these confused situations and states of mind and overcome that confusion and become comfortable with their birth sex. So we lost that case at the Ninth Circuit, unfortunately. The Supreme Court did not take the case. Then New Jersey was the second state that passed a similar law, virtually identical. We won, we litigated there. The court also upheld that law, but for a slightly different reason. Supreme Court did not take the case. That was the problem. They should have intervened back then. These were serious First Amendment violations, and they didn't. And maybe it was by God's providence because there was a different court back then. But as a result of that, not overruling these laws, 110 similar laws popped up all over the country, about 20 states, and the rest of those are cities and counties, all blue, Democrat controlled cities, counties, or states, including Colorado. Then in 2015, California said, well, we're going to use the same precedent in our case, the pickup case, and we're going to force licensed pregnancy centers to refer people to low cost or free abortions. So they passed a law telling crisis pregnancy centers they had to give this 22-word statement in 48-point font in multiple languages, and they had to put it on their brochures, on their websites, on billboards, and in their lobby, referring people coming to crisis pregnancy centers for low or no cost abortions. They said, well, if we can tell counselors what they can't say or what they can say, then we can tell licensed pregnancy centers what they must say. That went to the Supreme Court. We represented one of those crisis pregnancy centers, and the Supreme Court sided with our crisis pregnancy centers, striking it down. And in doing so, they cited the pickup case out of California, the King case out of New York, or out of New Jersey, and they abrogated them. So that opened up the opportunity to further litigate. Then we continued to litigate, and we won 2 cases at the Court of Appeals in Florida that struck down these laws. But then the court, in a separate case in Colorado, went the wrong way. So that set up the conflict. And now the case is before the U.S. Supreme Court, just argued. And Richard, I predict that as a result of what we saw in the arguments, we'll have a 6-3 or 7-2 win that will strike down these laws based upon the First Amendment. But the other thing I think too, Richard, not only will we have a great victory at the Supreme Court, because they all, a majority, vast majority of them seem to suggest and believe, like it is, that this is viewpoint discrimination in violation of the First Amendment. But with 87 of those laws still on the books since we struck down 23 of them, including Colorado, I anticipate, notwithstanding what the Supreme Court does in 2026, we'll have to continue to litigate in these states and cities and counties, because I believe some of these blue Democrat-controlled cities, counties, and states will oppose the Supreme Court and maintain those laws in existence until they're forced one by one to repeal them by virtue of a court order. So I think we're going to still have litigation ahead, but it's a great victory, I think, that's coming.
Oh, that's amazing. So Matt, what an incredible narrative that you just gave. Let me see if I can unpack it just a little bit. There was a case you were talking about just a couple of years ago. I think it came out of California. I think you referred to it as the pickup case, but it had to do with forced speech on pro-life, pregnancy resource centers, right? Where California.
Yeah, that was the NIFLA case that came out of California on the pregnancy centers. And it relied for justifying that they could force pregnancy centers to refer to abortion on the pickup case that we had in 2012.
Okay, so it relies on now the left, I think they call this ban on helping people who have same-sex attraction, they call it conversion therapy. And I remember going to some hearings here in Colorado when this bill was being considered. We were fighting against it, and there's this parade of horribles that they present to the state legislature of, electroshock therapy and abuse and I don't know what all, but all this, and they call it conversion therapy, and all counseling falls into that bucket and it ought to be banned because you can't change. If you're gay and you can't help it. Well, we know that's a lie, don't we? Because studies have shown that people that suffer with gender confusion or even same-sex attraction, the vast majority of them in their childhood years or teen years, when they're adults, they will figure these things out. Some people need help, but it's not an immutable characteristic. Is that your understanding as well?
That's right. The studies are between 85 and 90% of those that are gender confused in their adolescent and teen years, they naturally resolve that without any help at all. And they become content with how God made them as male or female. So if in that situation you then talk to an individual and you tell them, you know what, you're born in the wrong body. I know what we can do. Puberty blockers, cross-sex hormones, and then we'll have mutilating surgeries and all will be well. But they would naturally resolve anyway without that. Now you've really harmed them.
Mm-hmm.
And so these legislators and these political attempts refer to this as conversion therapy. There's no such thing in the counseling world called conversion therapy. It's a political term. You only see it used in the attempt to pass these particular restrictions. And they try to make it sound like, oh, you're trying to convert somebody. And then they try to make it sound like, you're doing more than just talking. I remember the first time I argued one of these cases in California, the judge says, so what happens? And she was thinking, well, you must be doing electroshock, water therapy, you're waterboarding them, you're doing something abusive to them. I said, what happens in a counseling room? The client talks, the counselor listens, they talk back and forth, they just talk. It's all speech. There's no electrodes attached to someone's head. They're not torturing these people. But that's the kind of idea that these LGBTQ advocates try to convey in order to pass these laws that are frankly very dangerous and unconstitutional.
Right. And so, I remember when this ban was passed in Colorado, I was stunned by it. As an attorney, I'm thinking, how can people not obviously see that this is a blatant restriction on freedom of speech? And yet they either don't care or they're blind to it. But is there any real logical argument against the First Amendment challenge?
There's not really any logical argument. And so we won 2 cases at the Court of Appeals that ruled exactly as I think how the Supreme Court will rule. And that is, these are clear violations of the First Amendment because they restrict viewpoint. They allow one viewpoint on human sexuality, for example, that you can quote, you take puberty blockers, cross-sex hormones, and you can become anyone you want to be. But they don't allow the viewpoint that you can change, that you can overcome these unwanted attractions, gender confusions, or behavior. They don't allow change in that respect. So it's a one-way street, and it's pretty obvious. I think that's what the Supreme Court justices are going to do. So I think we'll have a great victory in 2026. This has been 13 years in the making for us. We filed an amicus brief in that case, 2 amicus briefs in the Childs versus Salazar case. Well, we've been litigating this matter since 2012. We actually started the litigation in this particular arena. But again, I think what we'll see, because we've seen this in other areas where you have blue states, blue governments, Democratic controlled, politically motivated entities that really want to defy the US Supreme Court. They create sanctuary cities for illegal aliens. They create these, like California has just created basically a sanctuary to prescribe mifepristone, the abortion drug. So I anticipate they'll just simply not react to it and maintain these laws on the books. Well, we'll have to file, and there's 87 of those out there, against these entities and force each one to repeal their laws. It's going to be costly for them but I think they will resist. I anticipate they will on this issue because they're so blind to this matter.
Well, so this case coming out of Colorado, the law prohibits this so-called conversion therapy for minors. And we have a mental health counselor here who's challenging it. She's the plaintiff in the case. But the 10th Circuit upheld the law, Matt. How could they do that when it's so obviously contrary to the First Amendment?
Well, they actually upheld the law, even though we have 2 11th Circuit Court of Appeals decisions in our case called Otto and that was against Boca Raton, Florida, and Palm Beach County, Florida. And then also the Vaso case, which is against Hillsborough or Tampa. And those were directly on point. We had 2 wins. They just ignored it. They ignored the Supreme Court's NIFLA case, even though it expressly abrogated the pickup case out of California, the King case out of New Jersey. They ignored the 11th Circuit 2 decisions that we had. They just didn't care. So that's what I mean, Richard. I think they don't care, and they will actually resist. And that's why they're going to have to be forced to repeal these laws once the Supreme Court issues the decision.
Well, that's amazing, Matt. We sure hope that that happens, and believe that it will. What can people, average, everyday Americans, do? I mean, it's not like they can call up the Supreme Court justices and say, "Hey, I want you to vote this way." What can they do? Can they support Liberty Counsel? Can they pray? What do you think is the best way for people to respond?
Well, Richard, certainly they can support Liberty Counsel. Our website is lc.org, and obviously pray. And I wanted to bring up a case, Kim Davis, that is critically important for everyone to pray about. That is critically important. When a case is up before the Supreme Court, there's 2 things you can do: pray, and that's certainly critically important, and then provide support. And in this particular case, the Kim Davis case also is involved in this LGBTQ agenda. And you see the link between the two. They're wanting to prevent people from counseling individuals to come out of this LGBTQ trap. In Kim Davis's case, 10 years ago, on June 26, 2015, 5 lawyers, and that's the Chief Justice John Roberts' words, not mine, that was what he said in the dissent. 5 lawyers imposed their own will, not a legal judgment, and their opinion had nothing to do with the Constitution. Chief Justice John Roberts said that they attempted to rewrite the definition of marriage that had been so for millennia of human history, since really the beginning of creation. And then he said, "Who do we think we are? Indeed, who do we think we are to change God's definition of marriage?" Well, Kim Davis, the clerk of Rowan County, Kentucky, because of her religious convictions, she wanted her name removed from the marriage licenses. She couldn't put her name on the license and affirm a marriage that God does not design or bless. And so she was sued by 3 same sex couples. And then she was thrown in prison for 6 days. While she was in prison, one of the deputy clerks actually issued the license, striking off her name from the license. One of the couples said that's all they wanted. They went away. The other 2 continued to sue Kim Davis because they wanted her name on their license. The governor, the Democrat, Bashir, who refused to give her an accommodation, then said, "It's okay. The license is valid without her name." That was in September of 2015. Then a new governor gets elected, Matt Bevin, and he gives an executive order giving her an exemption and all the clerks. Then in April of 2016, the legislature unanimously passed a law exempting all clerks. So she got the exemption and the accommodation she wanted. No clerk now has to have their name on a same sex marriage license. But then they wanted her name on the license, and when they didn't get it, they came after her personally. So the litigation continued. We went to jury trials in 2023 with 2 juries in the same courtroom at the same time. One jury came back, no verdict for damages, and the other came back, the David Ermold, David Moore same-sex couple, and they gave him $100,000. The same judge who threw her in prison for 6 days then tacked on attorney's fees. So now she has a judgment against her personally for $360,000 and counting. And that case now is before the U.S. Supreme Court. There's 2 issues. Number one, we're asking the court to reverse the verdict against Kim based on the free exercise of religion. She got the accommodation she asked for. It was fairly quick, but she should have gotten it immediately. And number 2, and most importantly, we're asking the High Court to overturn the Obergefell opinion. And that's the issue that is garnering a lot of attention. So we just finished filing our reply brief at the petition stage. The justices now, in the next few days, and this is why it's critically important to pray, will meet in what they call a conference. We need 4 justices to vote yes to take the case. And then obviously that would be argued And then we'd need 5 justices, of course, to win this case. And this is critically important because, Richard, somebody says, well, same-sex marriage has been around for 10 years. What's the big deal? Well, here's the issue. From a policy standpoint, the Kim Davis case is taking on one of the most significant opinions and the most destructive opinions the Supreme Court has ever done, other than Roe versus Wade, the abortion opinion. Because what Obergefell stands for is that gender doesn't matter in a gender-based relationship. Obviously, marriage between a man and woman has been from the dawn of creation. Male and female are complementary, opposite and complementary. And they are designed to come together to procreate another human being in the very image of God. That's a gender-based relationship. And when the Supreme Court says, no, gender doesn't matter in this gender-based relationship. Well, if it doesn't matter here, then it doesn't matter when a man wants to compete in a woman's sports or enter the private spaces of women, or you want to have your 100 and plus, different pronouns. What this essentially says is God makes mistakes. He puts people in the wrong bodies. And instead of we being created in his image, male and female in his image, we can recreate ourselves in our own image, and we can even change ourselves as we recreate ourselves through time. This case, Obergefell, is very destructive. It's at the very foundation and root of the LGBTQ agenda, the ban on counseling. It's at the root of what happened against Charlie Kirk. He was assassinated while he was addressing the issue of the trans murder issues, and that's when he was taken out by a trans individual. It's at the very core of all of this because this is open rebellion against God. And when you speak truth into it, there's a violent reaction to that truth. So that's why this case is so critically important.
Yeah, wow, powerful. I want to cut that and broadcast it all over the place, Matt. That's phenomenal. I'm seeing another issue too as well. If I can ask for your comment on this. Roe versus Wade was finally overturned after 50 years in the Dobbs versus Mississippi case, and the Supreme Court said, there really wasn't any foundation for Roe versus Wade in the Constitution. It doesn't talk about abortion. Abortion is historically regulated by the states. This is not a federal issue, and furthermore, there's no indication that it's a fundamental human right that's guaranteed by the Constitution. Isn't that same judicial philosophy applicable here? Isn't Obergefell the same kind of unhinged, unrooted sort of liberal progressive activism that treats the Constitution as a blank slate instead of as a document that binds us?
Yeah, exactly. In fact, Gorsuch, during his concurring opinion in the Dobbs case overruling the abortion decisions of Roe and Casey, said, if it's not in the Constitution, which abortion is not, the court ought to remain neutral. And certainly, having a so-called right to an abortion is nowhere in the Constitution. And in fact, for most of our history, in fact, before Roe versus Wade was decided, abortion was illegal. It was banned. And then the Supreme Court issued this opinion in 1973 and went completely the opposite way. In fact, they traced this through history, not only in Greek and Roman history, but in the early European history, in the colonial history, and then when we had statutes and laws on the books. It had been banned, and then they went the other way. So it has no foundation in the Constitution. And that's the same way with same-sex marriage. Throughout our history, through millennia of human history, there's not been same-sex marriage, even before the United States, through Greece and Rome, all the previous nations before them, through the European countries, in the colonial period, in our founding of this country, up until the Supreme Court issued this opinion. And so it's the same thing. It has no basis in the Constitution. It's not rooted in our history. It's not critical to our foundation. In fact, not only has same-sex marriage been banned, not even thought about, but even homosexuality or homosexual practices have historically also been banned as well, until the Supreme Court made a decision later in the Romer case. So, what you have here is the same thing with regards to abortion. This is a bad decision from the Supreme Court. It needs to be rectified. And not only that, as a policy matter, it sends a terrible message that gender doesn't matter in a gender-based relationship. And if it doesn't matter in marriage, which it's obvious, then how can we argue it matters anyplace else?
Yeah.
Obviously, it does matter in marriage, critically important in marriage, because God created us in his image, male and female.
Absolutely. And, judges act like, there's this doctrine that has invaded and pervaded American jurisprudence now since, I don't know, Matt, what, the 1940s? But the idea that the Constitution is a living document and that it needs to change with the times. And guess who gets to decide what that change is? Well, it's these unelected judges. Well, that's not a Republican system, is it? And it's certainly not what our founders intended. We're founded on something called natural law, and that our rights come from God. And Obergefell and Roe before it both seem to be 100% contrary to those founding principles. Do you agree with that?
I do agree with that. And they have a connection too, because abortion is sexuality without the consequence of procreation.
Right.
And same sex relations is sexuality without the possibility of procreation.
Oh.
It's a complete aberration of how God created us. And I would also say this, Richard, when Roe versus Wade was overturned, some of the legislators that were pro-life became silent. They were calling for the overturn of Roe, but then when it happened, where were they? And then the church, some people in the churches, some leaders in the church, they remained silent. And so we have to be prepared for this. We have to be prepared, particularly as the church. We can complain against legislators, and certainly we need to elect people in office that are good and godly. But the church, the pulpits need to be speaking specifically about the importance of marriage.
Yes.
It is not just simply two people coming together of opposite sex versus same sex or same sex. It's not the same thing. There are spiritual consequences to redefining God's definition of marriage.
Absolutely. And yeah, the church needs to address these issues. There's things that, Matt, as created beings, I think Blackstone would say this, we're not free to decide, right? God has established these things, and it's our responsibility to discover and comply with his laws, not to try to reinvent them.
Well, there are consequences to violating, physical laws of nature like gravity and other things. Those are obvious, but there's also consequences to violating the moral laws of nature that God created into the natural created order. And what he created into the natural created order is he created us male and female. We're not 100 different genders. You can't change your DNA. He created us either male or female. It's a beautiful creation that God created perfectly. And this actually takes God's creation and says, you made a mistake, God. We're going to change it. We're going to create it in our own image. And in fact, what this does is it allows someone to say, I was born in the wrong body. Gender doesn't matter, so gender is just a product of my mind. There is no objective reality of male and female. There is no objective reason for marriage as the union of one man and one woman. Therefore, I'll just simply create my own world into my own existence. It's open rebellion against God. From a spiritual, biblical standpoint, this is critically important. And I would encourage pastors, church leaders, every one of us to really delve into why this is so critically important. Why is it when we talk about these things, for example, when we say marriage is the union of a man and a woman, or where there's only two sexes, male and female, why do you have this violent reaction that comes against people, say like Charlie Kirk, or in our case, or anyone else's cases that speaks on this? You get death threats. We have gotten a lot of death threats over this very issue. And the more the Kim Davis case is in the media, the more death threats we get. Why is that happening? I think it's a spiritual root cause.
Yes.
It's a dark demonic issue. And it is Satan's trap to ultimately destroy individuals, to actually take God's creation, pervert it in a way to make it look acceptable. And what it is a deadly trap.
Man, very well said. Well, we have 2 minutes left. Max, I want to ask you about a new case that's come up called Louisiana versus US FDA. Louisiana is suing the Food and Drug Administration over the abortion pill and its deregulation, if you will. In other words, the federal government has abdicated responsibility over this dangerous drug, and it's allowing, I don't want to be too graphic, but sometimes we have to. Babies are literally being aborted in toilets, in homes all across, in hotels all over America because of this unregulation. And it's polluting our water supply, not to mention killing millions and millions of innocent babies, even in states that are now trying to exercise their lawful power to restrict abortion. Do you think the Louisiana is going to succeed in this? And is this a hopeful sign?
I think this is a hopeful sign, and I think there's other efforts that are taking place with RFK Jr. And the Secretary of HHS and also the FDA. They are reevaluating the mifepristone abortion pill. We have been working with his office and also other members and agencies in Washington, D.C. We have a website actually called abortioninourwater.org, abortioninourwater.org, on the very issue, Richard, that you're talking about, that this mifepristone, with its long-lasting metabolites, is going into the water system because the abortions are taking place in the homes or hotels over the restroom, over the commode. And these chemicals go into the water supply system. They're not filtered out. And also, what else is going in the water supply system? Aborted human remains. They were never designed to filter this kind of system and human remains from the water system. So this is a very serious issue. We need to stop mifepristone. We need to stop it from going across state lines. We need to stop it from going into our water supply.
Absolutely. Matt, real quick, how can people connect with you and support the work that you're doing?
Richard, they can go to Liberty Counsel's website, lc.org. Just very simple, 2 letters, lc.org. Lots of information there. You can sign up for our emails, newsletters, and a lot of other information. If you need legal help, there's a form there, lc.org.
I encourage everybody to sign up for Matt's emails. I get them in my inbox every day. Super informative, super helpful. You won't get that kind of analysis anywhere else. So be sure to do that at lc.org. And wanted to remind everybody about our free gift today, Spirit, Soul, and Body, this booklet by Andrew Womack, which is a condensed version of his book by the same name that's foundational to all of his teaching and revelation. And encourage you to get this by going to truthandlibertygtn.com. Share your email with us and we'll send it to you for free today. Matt, thank you for joining us. It's been a pleasure as always.
Thank you, Richard. Always good to be with you.